Dick Campbell from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Welcome to another one of my great moments in history presentations. For the past 75 years, I have been a student of history. And with this interest, since 1999, I've created a variety of 11 history stories. And now I would like to share one of these moments with you entitled Following the Lewis and Clark Expedition. On June 20, 1803, Thomas Jefferson sent the following instructions to Meriwether Lewis. The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as, by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purpose of commerce. With these words, President Thomas Jefferson outlined the chief purpose of one of the most important expeditions in American history, finding an all-water route to the Pacific Ocean and charting of the vast territory added to the United States by the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. We now remember it as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, after its two commanders, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They both were experienced Army officers, accustomed to frontier command, who equipped and disciplined a small military party so well that it covered more than 8,000 miles to the Pacific Ocean and back, with the loss of only one life and with only one actively hostile encounter with Indians over a period of 28 months at a total cost of $38,722.25. Much of the region Lewis and Clark covered had only recently become United States territory. The vast interior of the North American continent, from the mouth of the Mississippi River to the headwaters of the Missouri River, had belonged to Spain, until Spain transferred the land to France in 1800. In 1803, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte of France decided to abandon his ambitions in North America and sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States. With this sale, the U.S. government acquired 830,000 square miles of territory for $15 million, which was about 3 cents per acre, a bargain that more than doubled the size of the United States. The treaty was signed on May 2, 1803, and ceremoniously transferred from France to the United States on March 10, 1804, on the St. Louis riverfront at a spot near the present Gateway Arch. With the purchase of the Louisiana Territory completed, Jefferson set about putting together an expedition to explore this new territory. He appointed his personal secretary, 29-year-old Meriwether Lewis, to lead the group. Lewis, a native of Virginia, had some military experience. Prior to the expedition, Jefferson had Lewis study botany, map-making, astronomy, the use of celestial instruments, geology, zoology, and the latest medical knowledge under Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the most famous physicians of the day. For this combined scientific and pioneering expedition, Lewis needed a fellow officer to serve as his co-leader. He chose a friend from his Army days, 33-year-old William Clark. Clark, too, was from a Virginia family, one also with a distinguished military tradition. 3 of his 5 brothers were generals in the Revolution, and one of them was George Rogers Clark, a hero of the Revolutionary War. William Clark was a skilled cartographer and was responsible for mapping the route explored to the Pacific and back. On June 19, 1803, Lewis wrote to Clark, who was in Kentucky at the time, and told him of the mission and plans. He concluded with an invitation to greatness. Quote, "If there therefore is anything in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and its honors, believe me, there is no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them with as yourself." Unquote. Well, weeks went by with no word from Clark. As a backup, Lewis prepared to ask Lieutenant Moses Hook, his second choice, if he would accept the role. But Clark's reply finally came on July 29. Quote, "My friend, I do assure you that no man lives with whom I would prefer to undertake such a trip as yourself." Unquote. Clark wrote to Lewis, thus ending any thoughts of what history might have come to call the Lewis and Hook expedition. The co-leaders set about the task of choosing the men to accompany them. They would have to be independent, self-reliant, and reliable, yet work well with others and be able to take commands. In Lewis's work, they looked for men who were good hunters, stout, healthy, unmarried, accustomed to the woods, and capable of bearing bodily fatigue. Well, how did they travel? The Corps was to rely on a number of different means of travel. The method was determined by the geography of the region in which they traveled. No matter what the method, there were large amounts of supplies and trade items that were required to be transported. The keelboat, pictured here, it served as the command vessel for the first part of the journey. Constructed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it was 55 feet long, 8 feet wide, drew only about 3 feet of water, and could carry about 12 tons of goods and supplies. It resembled a galley with benches for 22 oarsmen, a deck at the bow, and an elevated stern deck above a cabin. Extremely versatile, the keelboat could be rowed, sailed, pushed along with setting poles, or pulled by ropes. Traveling with the keelboat were 2 smaller boats that the captains called pirogues, shown here on either side of the keelboat. These were 2 flat-bottomed open boats, one red, one white, that were also rigged to use a small sail. Like the keelboat, they could be sailed or rowed, and with a large central deck area, they could carry up to 8 tons of cargo. Canoes. The members of the Corps knew that once the keelboat was sent back, they would need additional watercraft beside the 2 pirogues. They would have to have dugout canoes to carry the men and supplies west to the mountains. Along the way, 15 of these were made, when needed, from cottonwood trees and ponderosa pines, and they ranged in size from 25 to 30 feet. Each weighed more than a ton. From a cut log in the top picture shown here to a dugout canoe in the lower part of the picture took about a week to complete. Bull boats. The Indian bull boats were circular in form, and the framework was made out of willow or cottonwood branches held together by leather thongs. Skins, usually buffalo, were stretched over the branch framework. They were used to transport goods and people from one side of the Missouri River to the other when the expedition was staying near the Mandan Indian villages. Horses. These were primarily used by hunters who paralleled the rivers on shore and used them to carry game back to the expedition as needed. Horses were also the crucial element for the successful crossing of the mountains as pictured here. The men themselves would not be able to carry everything they needed. Friendly Indians helped them obtain horses when needed at several significant places along the trail. Thus, using a variety of means of transportation, the Corps of Discovery was successfully able to cross the continent to the Pacific and return. Well, what did they take with them? Here's a short list of the variety of the items and amounts they thought they would need for the long trip. The captains also packed folding telescopes, surveying equipment, sextants for measuring vertical angles of latitude, and a chronometer for longitude measurements. Perhaps most important, they made sure they had plenty of paper, ink powder, and pencils to prepare their invaluable journals. Well, when did the expedition begin? The Lewis and Clark expedition began in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Lewis picked up the keelboat he had ordered built for the voyage. The boat was supposed to be ready July 20, 1803, but when Lewis arrived, he found it nowhere near completion. Frustrated, Lewis soothed himself by buying a large black Newfoundland dog for $20, a staggering sum for a dog. He called the dog Seaman, and as far as we know, Seaman accompanied the expedition throughout the entire journey. The keelboat was finally finished on August 31, and Lewis set out down the Ohio River with at least 11 other men and a single pirogue. It took them 6 weeks to travel down the shallow Ohio River, arriving on October 14 at Louisville in Indiana Territory, where Lewis picked up William Clark and several other crewmen. These men became known as the 9 young men from Kentucky. Clark's servant, York, pictured here, also joined the crew at this time. And in most respects, York served as an equal member of the crew throughout the voyage. The Corps left Louisville on October 26 and continued down the Ohio River to the Mississippi River, where they traveled up to the village of St. Louis. There, they set up camp near the mouth of the Missouri River on December 12, 1803, on the Wood River, which they called Camp River du Bois. Throughout the next 5 months, Clark continued to recruit and train crewmen into a disciplined military unit, while Lewis spent most of the winter in St. Louis, gathering information and acquiring additional supplies. Well, what route did they follow? Beginning in May 1804, the route they followed was up the Missouri River to its headwaters in western Montana, a distance of over 2,400 miles, then north by land travel, then west across the mountains in Idaho, then down the Clearwater River to the Snake River, then to the Columbia River, and finally to the Pacific Ocean. What were some of the hardships and hazards encountered along the way? Well, for the Corps of Discovery, dangers and hardships were daily occurrences. The problems that they caused were usually minor, but a few became life-threatening. Indians, almost all of the encounters with Indians were friendly and peaceful. Information, food, and goods were traded with them. Petty thievery was mentioned in the journals as the biggest problem. Grizzly bears. They were unknown back in the East, and encounters with them often proved dangerous and threatening. The Corps confronted these huge bears bears all along the upper Missouri River in North Dakota and Montana. It often took 8 to 10 shots to bring one down. One lone man was no match for the grizzly, as their rifles were muzzle loaders and fired only one shot at a time, so they always hunted in pairs or more. Mosquitoes. Areas were thick with them. They were very tormenting, and as they would get in the nose, throat, eyes, and ears. Rivers, rapids, and falls. There's no doubt that the falls and rapids were great challenges. They took a toll on the members and equipment. Many difficult portages were undertaken. The fact that they never lost a person when encountering all the rapids and falls was a credit to their skill or luck. Mountains and snow. Their passage over the mountains in Idaho was terrible. They were steep and rocky, trees were fallen, temperatures were cold, snows were heavy, no water to drink except melted snow, and game nearly non-existent. Lack of food. Even though they brought large quantities of food along with them, they could not bring enough to last the whole journey. They expected to live off the land when necessary. There was a large number of people in their party, and they required a large amount of food. It has been estimated that each person required up to 8 to 9 pounds of meat a day to provide him with sufficient energy. That's 32 quarter-pounders a day. This was no problem until they got to the mountains, where food and game was scarce. Accidents and sickness. From the onset of the journey, the members of the party suffered from one problem or another: improper diet, exhaustion from hard work, exposure to cold water and freezing temperatures, frostbite, boils, dysentery, diarrhea, typhoid fever, malaria, venereal disease, blisters, sore and cut feet, twisted ankles, and infections from normal cuts and bruises. These hardships were all seemingly part of a normal day. When you read about their journey, one historian reflected, quote, "It's just the reverse of when you learn more about something and you say, oh, so that's how they did it. With Lewis and Clark, you learn more about it and say, but how did they do that? How did they pole, paddle, and tow vessels thousands of miles upstream, trudging through muck and over sandbars, heaving against swirling currents, plagued by mosquitoes and disease? How did they portage huge dugout canoes and tons of cargo around miles of waterfalls on bloody, cactus-punctured feet? And how could anyone survive all this, make it to the Pacific Ocean, and then bear to turn around and repeat the entire journey in reverse? And now, I'd like to take you along the Expedition Trail as I followed it 13 years ago in the fall of 2003 with an Elder Hostel tour bus group. We took 18 days to go from St. Louis, Missouri to Astoria, Oregon, traveling an average of about 200 miles a day between overnight motel stops. We were fortunate to see many of the key landmarks, forts, and museums along the way. At the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition, St. Louis was 40 years old, with a population of about 1,000 people. It was here that Lewis gathered additional supplies for the expedition's success. It's hard to imagine that the Corps of Discovery would put in very near where the Gateway Arch today dominates the sky. At 630 feet, the arch is America's tallest monument. Beneath the arch in the Museum of Westward Expansion, our group marveled especially at the floor-to-ceiling photographs in the museum of the sites along the trail. On May 14, 1804, Clark and the Corps of Discovery departed Camp River du Bois and headed up the Missouri River using sails, oars, and long poles to move forward. Here's a little humor break along the way from cartoonist Chad Carpenter, who prints the cartoon Tundra. May 14, 1804, the Lewis and Clark and Filbert expedition begins its historic 8,000-mile journey. Are we there yet? And less than 100 miles later, Filbert mysteriously disappears. From May 16 through May 21, they paused at St. Charles, waiting for Lewis to arrive overland from St. Louis with their final supplies. St. Charles was a small village with about 450 inhabitants. Founded in 1769 as a fur trading post, it was the first permanent white settlement on the Missouri River. Departing from St. Charles on May 21, with 45 men, the expedition traveled up the Missouri River in their keelboat and the two smaller pirogues for the next 6 months, until they reached the home of the Mandan Indians in November. The route is shown on this picture. When they set out from St. Charles, they were on their own. They had no supply line, no further orders from Jefferson could reach them. And like other explorers before them, Lewis and Clark knew not what lay ahead, but whatever it turned out to be, they would have to deal with the challenges with what they had with them. Through the long, hot summer of 1804, they laboriously worked their way upriver. Numerous navigational hazards, including sunken trees, sandbars, collapsing riverbanks, and sudden squalls of high winds with drenching rains, slowed their progress. There were other problems, including disciplinary floggings, 2 desertions, a man dishonorably discharged for mutiny, and the death of a crew member. As would be the pattern of much of the journey, Lewis spent a great deal of his time ashore with his dog Seaman, walking and exploring, collecting plant and animal specimens, and noting details of the land, while the boats made their average progress of about 8 to 12 miles per day. Clark remained with the boats, making certain that everything proceeded according to schedule. Their journals recorded the first scientific descriptions of 178 plant specimens and 122 animals and birds. An interesting stop for us was at the Lewis and Clark State Park at Ottawa, Iowa, on the shores of Blue Lake. On August 9, 1804, the expedition arrived at this site right next to the Missouri River. Today, the river is about 4 miles away to the west. The highlight of our visit here was the opportunity to see the only authentic full-scale reproduction of the expedition's keelboat pictured here. Up the river at Sioux City, Iowa, we visited the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center and Sergeant Floyd Riverboat Museum. It seems almost unbelievable that during nearly 2.5 years in the wilderness, only one member of the expedition died. Sergeant Charles Floyd probably died of a burst appendix, a condition unknown to medical science until 20 years after the expedition, and not operated on successfully until 1884. The Floyd Monument marking his grave, pictured lower left on this slide, was dedicated in 1901, the first site ever to be registered as an official National Historic Landmark. The 17-foot-tall sculpture of Lewis, Clark, and Seaman, pictured right, greets visitors at the entrance of the Interpretive Center. As the expedition moved through the Dakotas, the need to find a place to spend the winter became acute. On October 26, 1804, roughly 1,600 miles from St. Louis, the Corps of Discovery reached the villages established by the Mandan and Hidatsa Indians. These villages of 4,400 people were more populous then than Philadelphia at that time, and formed the cultural and economic mecca of the northern Great Plains. It was at this point that the members of the Corps built a triangular-shaped cottonwood log building and called it Fort Mandan, in honor of the local inhabitants. This is where they spent the long, cold winter of 1804-05. It was here that the men met French-Canadian trapper Toussaint Charbonneau and his young Indian wife, Sacagawea, who were to become among the most famous members of the party. The Mandans helped Lewis and Clark draw crude maps of what lay ahead and warned them of a great waterfall many miles away. When the Corps reached the Rocky Mountains, they were told that they would have to find the Shoshone tribe and buy some horses. To do that, they would need a guide and interpreter. And that is why Charbonneau and Sacagawea, who was pregnant at the time, were chosen to go along. Since no woman ever accompanied a war party, she would also confirm the expedition's friendly intentions to all the Indian tribes they would encounter. Sacagawea was a Lemhi Shoshone Indian who had been kidnapped by the Hidatsa Indians during a raid at the Three Forks of the Missouri River in present-day Montana when she was 12 years old back in 1800. She gave birth to her son, Jean Baptiste, nicknamed Pomp, on February 11, 1805, at Fort Mandan. The Corps set off from Fort Mandan on April 7, 1805, in the two pirogues and 6 large newly built dugout canoes, which were packed to the gunwales, ready to head upstream, with 31 men, a woman, a baby boy less than 2 months old, and a dog. The keelboat was sent back down the Missouri River to St. Louis with the captain's reports, 4 live magpie birds, a live prairie dog, and many other specimens to President Jefferson. Thus began the second all-water leg of their journey, heading west on the upper Missouri, which would take them for the next 4 months to the foot of the Rocky Mountains, and hopefully a rendezvous with the Shoshone Indians and some horses. Lewis wrote in his journal, quote, "We were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden, and these little vessels contained every article by which we were to expect to subsist and defend ourselves," unquote. From now on, they would be as completely out of communication with the civilized world as 20th century spacemen circling the backside of the moon. They could receive no messages nor send any. Moving up the river from the Mandan villages, they passed the confluence of the Yellowstone River with the Missouri River on April 26, and entered a country where Lewis observed immense herds of buffalo, elk, deer, and antelopes feeding in one common and boundless pasture. On June 13, while scouting ahead of the rest of the expedition, Lewis reached the Great Falls of the Missouri, towering up to 90 feet. He also discovered 4 more waterfalls farther upstream. The expedition had to portage 18 miles around these 5 falls. They attached wheels cut from cottonwood trees to their 6 canoes to drag and push them overland in 4 round trips totaling over 11 days. Transporting the huge dugouts and baggage up the steep incline from the river and traversing the long stretch of prairie lands was an exhausting ordeal, menaced by grizzly bears, rattlesnakes, and flash floods, mauled by hailstorms, their feet mercilessly jabbed by prickly pear cactus added to their difficult travel. After their grueling portage around the 5 waterfalls, the Corps built 2 additional large dugout canoes, and with the 6 smaller canoes continued up the Missouri on July 15 for the mountains. It had been months since they had seen any Indians. They were starting to get anxious, knowing the party would need horses to travel over the Continental Divide. Moreover, the captains figured they had to be getting close to Sacagawea's home country, the land of the Shoshones. It was decided they would take turns traveling overland to increase the chances of meeting Indians. Clark and 3 others left the canyon on foot with no clue of the river spectacle they were about to miss. Lewis led the canoes upriver on July 19 through an area of breathtaking scenic beauty. Limestone cliffs rose from the water's edge on either side, perpendicularly up to 1,200 feet. There was scarcely a spot on shore where the canoes could pull over. Lewis called this place the Gates of the Mountains. On July 27, the expedition arrived at a place where the Missouri divided into 3 forks. At this point, Sacagawea offered reason for hope, recognizing this as the place of her kidnapping some 5 years earlier by the Hidatsa Indians. Here, the captains had to decide which of the 3 forks would lead them to the Continental Divide. At this important expedition landmark, 3 rivers join to form the Missouri River headwaters. Pictured here is an aerial view of the 3 forks. The Jefferson flows in from the southwest, the Madison from the south, and the Gallatin River from the southeast. The captains decided to follow the Jefferson River. Lewis went ahead of the main party, seeking the Shoshones. On August 12, he reached a saddle in a high ridge, today's Lemhi Pass, from which he disappointingly saw towering, snow-covered mountains many miles to the west. The sight of these mountains shattered his hopes for an easy portage to a major branch of the Columbia River. On August 17, 1805, Lewis and his men came in contact with some Shoshone Indians. He followed them to their camp and met their chief named Kameawait. A few days later, Clark arrived at the camp with the rest of the Corps, including Sacagawea. It was then, as they were negotiating for horses and supplies, that Sacagawea, acting as an interpreter, recognized Kameawait as her brother. This made obtaining information, horses, and guides from the Shoshones much easier than they had thought it would be. This could possibly be considered one of the most significant reunions in American history, as without horses, the Lewis and Clark expedition would have been unable to continue on. With Sacagawea providing vital service as interpreter, a Shoshone guide named Old Toby was hired, and trading with the Indians for riding and pack horses was successful. After a short stay with their new friends, the now horse-mounted corps headed into the formidable Bitterroot Mountains. Traveling north from Lemhi Pass, as highlighted on this map, the expedition had a terrible time getting over Lost Trail Pass. On September 2, 1805, Clark wrote, quote, "We were obliged to cut a road over rock hillsides where our horses were in danger of slipping to their certain destruction," unquote. After a 9-day struggle, the expedition camped on September 9 near the confluence of the Bitterroot River and Lolo Creek at what is now the town of Lolo, Montana. This site they named Traveler's Rest. They paused here to give the men a break and to build a surplus of meat before setting out on the Lolo Trail. Pictured here is a wooded area where back in 2003 we met with a Lewis and Clark historian. He told us that in the summer of 2002, 14 years ago, archaeologists found evidence of the Corps' mercury-tainted latrine and central cook fire, positioning this area as one of the few sites in the nation with physical proof of the expedition's visit. The mercury came from Russia's thunderbolts, a name given to a purging pill recommended by Dr. Benjamin Rush for nearly all the ills of mankind at that time. It was composed of calomel, a purgative, jalap, a laxative, and mercury, a metallic element poisonous to the body. Lewis had packed 50 dozen of them for the trip. The primary medical treatment at that time was purging and bloodletting. On September 11, the expedition began its assault of the Lolo Trail over the Bitterroots, a march that would prove the most taxing part of the entire 28-month trip. It covers some of the most rugged and remote country in the Rockies. With little game to shoot and freezing wet weather to endure, the Lolo Trail challenged the Corps, turning their 11-day, 170-mile passage into an excruciating race against starvation. They had to kill and eat 3 of their horses to survive. It's easy to understand, again, that there might have been a few tensions along the way, as humorously shown by one of Larson's Far Side cartoons. After successfully crossing the mountains on the westward journey, but nearly starving, the Corps finally met the Nez Perce Indians near present-day Weepi, Idaho, where they were given food. They then set up a camp on September 26, farther west on the Clearwater River at a place they named Canoe Camp. Here they felled several large ponderosa pines and set about building 5 more large dugout canoes. Trusting their 38 horses to the Nez Perce Indians on October 7, the Corps traveled down the Clearwater River to its joining with the Snake River, and then took the Snake River to the Columbia River, and by early November, the expedition was making better than 30 miles a day down the lower Columbia River. On November 7, William Clark, who believes he can see the ocean, scribbles his immortal line in his journal, quote, "Ocean in view, Oh, the joy, unquote. Actually, they were still looking at the Columbia River estuary. The ocean lay about 20 miles to the west, no great distance, but violent storms stranded them in a series of desperate camps along the north shore. The Corps of Discovery arrived at their ultimate goal, the mouth of the Columbia River, by November 15, 1805. After surveying the country on both sides of the river, they all agreed on November 24 as to where they should establish their winter fort, deciding on the south side of the river. It was the first time in American history that a black slave, York, and a woman, Sacagawea, had agreed together with an all-white group. They completed Fort Clatsop on December 30 and spent most of the winter visiting with various Indian tribes, while the captains worked on their journals and Clark in particular on his maps. From the time of their arrival at Fort Clatsop until they departed 106 days later, it rained every day but 12, leaving them wet and cold, with the clothes literally rotting off their backs. They ate tainted salmon, spoiled elk meat, and dog meat, and suffered numbing boredom and a plague of infesting fleas. When March 1806 approached, they were ready to depart and head back to St. Louis. On March 23, 1806, the expedition started back up the Columbia River in newly acquired Indian canoes. And for most of their 6-month journey home, Lewis and Clark retraced the route they had followed to the Pacific. However, on July 3, at Traveler's Rest in present-day Montana, the captains divided the men into as many as 5 separate groups in order to explore uncharted land along the Maria and Yellowstone rivers. On July 17, Lewis's party followed the Marias route north of the Missouri River, where they had an encounter with several Blackfeet Indians that resulted in 2 Indian deaths, while Clark's party traveled east down the Yellowstone River. On August 12, after being separated for 41 days, the Corps of Discovery was reunited back on the Missouri River. All were well. On September 23, 1806, after a journey of 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days, the expedition arrived back in St. Louis. Here's a copy of William Clark's letter to his brother Jonathan, with the official word of their successful mission. They had traveled more than 8,000 miles, established friendships with several native nations, collected invaluable botanical and zoological specimens, produced surprisingly accurate maps, and compiled detailed records of the entire expedition. They also showed that there was no all-water route to the Pacific. Lewis could not know that history would show that he had failed to find the best route to the west. All he knew was that he had followed his president's orders and had returned successful. It does not matter that the route he followed did not become the major road to the west coast, or that years had to pass before the Oregon Trail was opened in 1842, and thousands of settlers made their way to the Promised Land. Lewis was assured of his achievement, and his accomplishments stand alone today. It was an enormous achievement to take a group of more than 30 men, plus a woman and an infant, across an uncharted continent, let alone to return with only 1 death. This could only be achieved with great leadership, wonderful organization, or unending luck. Planning, leadership, and selection of skilled and able men, combined with discipline, loyalty, and luck, lots of luck, held the core of discovery together. In closing, here's what Lewis wrote to President Jefferson on his return to St. Louis. Quote, "Sir, it is with pleasure that I announce to you the safe arrival of myself and a party at 12 o'clock today at this place with our papers and baggage. In obedience to your orders, we have penetrated the continent of North America to the Pacific Ocean and sufficiently explored the interior of the country to affirm with confidence that we have discovered the practicable route which does exist across the continent by means of the navigable branches of the Missouri and Columbia rivers. Orders fulfilled, mission accomplished." And I thank you for your interest in this great moment in history.